Hello, I'm Frank Conkling, and this is Panda Consulting's ArcGIS workshop. Today, we're going to continue a series that we've been doing about legal descriptions, how to map them, and such. If you remember, we started out just sort of giving a description of what a legal description is, how to interpret them, different parts of it, and then we've gone through the public land survey system. Today, we're going to go and talk about mapping a meets and bounds legal description. And this is the type that most people think of when they see a legal description. And we'll explain what it is and how to really think about it, mostly from both a mapper's and a surveyor's standpoint, since I'm both. So before we start, though, just sort of to remind everybody, if you go down to the QR code at the lower right corner, they'll take you to paniconsulting.com, our website. It'll tell you who we are, what we do, why we do it, how we do it, and such. Give you also access to our blog. And also, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter if you'd like. Again, just a reminder, Panda Consulting is an ESRI business partner, and we are the first in the nation to have gotten the parcel management specialty, and we are a state and local specialty here. All right, so let's start talking about what are the topics going to be today. And first of all, we'll start with what is a meets and bounds description. All right. What is a meets and bounds description? What does it really describe and how is it describing it? And then sort of what are meets? What are bounds? What are the measurements? What are references or boundaries included on there? How to look at them? What happens if there's a conflict? And then finally, we'll talk about some of the tools that you use in ArcGIS Pro and best practices on how to go and map them. Um, Before we start, just a reminder, anybody who's here live while we're recording it, there is if you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and put them in the chat window. And if I'm not paying attention, Mickey with Panda Consulting will go and remind me. She'll interrupt me and she'll remind me that there's a comment or a question there we have to answer. All right, let's get going then. All right, so let's start out with this. This is what is a meets and bounds description? And really, it's a legal description by which the boundary of the lands are described by listing the courses around it. If you think back to a couple months ago, we talked about the livery of cession, which is the Old English covenant that we used to do, in which they would go through this process, this procedure, in which the person selling the land, the person buying the land, would go and walk around the boundary. And this is in fact what they were doing. They were describing that land by the courses or the boundaries of it. They would say they would give you the meets, and the meets is in fact the measurements. They would say go along this road or go this measurement for a certain distance on here. But then there's also the bounds part. The bounds parts are the references to the lines, the boundaries, or in survey speak, the monuments. Those things that it says along, with, to, those are all special calls within a legal description, especially a meets and bounds description, in which they're saying, if there's a problem, if it's not quite exact, go here. This is what I want you to do. This is what the intent is. So a sample of a meets and bounds description is this right here. And this is actually a fairly good one. It talks about going and along certain areas, tells you where it's starting at, and then it's going, then it runs along. And then here's where most people think about when they think about this is they think about this part. They think about this bearing and this distance, and they think that's actually what you need to go and use. When in fact, what it's actually telling you is that right here, it says run along the western boundary of that southeast quarter for that distance. So if it turns out that that bearing and that distance are different, you use the bounding part, the green part, instead of the red part on here. All right, so It's interesting when I talk to most mappers and we talk about what's important in this legal description, they're both important, but one is a little bit more important than the other. And we'll talk a little bit about, well, what happens when they don't jive? What happens when you have a conflict in here? And how do you analyze what you're supposed to use for that conflict? All right, so let's look at this. So again, the meets or measurements that are used in the courses, they're usually bearings and distances, and they could use other references. They instead of bearings, there might be azimuths with true north or some sort of directional reference in there. And then there's distances, and you can mix different distances up. Some of the strange ones I've seen are everything from um, some poles, chains. I've seen some old legal descriptions out in the Southwest area, in which they'd use a command or a linear measurement called a vara, a VARA. The strangest one I ever saw was one in which they described a distance as being a smoke, three smokes along this line towards that mountain. And the smoke was defined as being the distance that you could travel on a slow moving horse while smoking a loosely packed cigarette. So, it's not real critical what those things are, but it's just a way of measuring on there what's supposed to happen. So often I get a question that with these, why is it different? Why is it because somebody didn't know how to measure, or why is there a difference in here? And the first thing I would always point to is that recognizing that when a legal description was written, it was written using the most precise measurement tools that they had at that time. But some of these descriptions were written back in the 1850s, at least in the United States, once we started doing some of the public land survey system, and some of them are even older. And those measuring tools were not very precise in what they were measuring. I see here up here in the upper right. This is a Gunter's chain. This is the measurement tool in which most of the public land survey system in the United States was measured. Is a chain. A chain is 66 feet long. Each of these links in here were in fact 1/100th of a chain on there. So there's not very precise, but it was accurate enough for what they were attempting to do. Further on down, this is one of the first measuring tools that I used, which was a steel tape. Steel tape always had problems in that if you're measuring something down here in Florida, especially, if you're measuring something, heat will go and expand and cold will contract the distance and the length of a steel tape, so that you have to be careful. Matter of fact, as we were measuring, if we were trying to measure very, very accurately and not just a general measurement, we'd actually record what the temperature of the air was, because that way we could go and apply what was called the coefficient of expansion for a steel tape, because we knew that in the afternoon, the actual tape was longer than in the morning when we started out, because it had stretched out, it was heated up. So all sorts of little things that can play into the measurements that you're taking or the measurements that are recording on a legal description. But this is also the biggest one here, is this right here. The differences between ground and grid distances. And this is sort of one of those unspoken secrets, in that within a legal description, the measurements are given on the ground because the assumption is that you're going to be actually recreating this on the ground on here. However, when you're mapping, those are grid distances. And the difference between a ground distance and a grid distance, matter of fact, here we can see that in fact, this is our grid, our projection grid. And this is the ellipsoid here, and this is the ground. So that if in fact we measure a distance here, and we're given that distance here and we try to apply it onto the grid, depending upon how that grid is defined, how much distortion is. Literally, it's how far away from the central meridian of that projection system. There's going to be a difference between the ground distance and the distance that it's measured on the grid. And this is something that a lot of people don't take into account. The question is for most parcel mapping, do you need to do it? Not necessarily. But from a surveying standpoint, you need to be aware that there is a difference between ground and grid, and make sure that you take that into account. So it's not always that there's a mistake, not always that it just wasn't done very well. Often it's a combination of the precision of the tools that are used and then the difference between what we're trying to put that distance in as far as whether or not that's a good distance that we might be able to use on here. So the bounds portion of a legal description, of meets and bounds legal description, refers more to the intent of that course. What is that course? What is that bearing and distance supposed to be? What is it? It's giving you more information, and it's giving you actually a better information about what that's supposed to be. So it refers to the intent of that course. Where is that supposed to be? And you'll look for things like along, parallel with, to. Those are the keywords that you want to look for when you're interpreting a legal description, a meets and bounds description, because that's really what it's telling you as you're going through here. And then the question becomes, well, what happens when there's a difference? What happens when there's a difference between the distance that you're given and the distance that it measures on your data set, or the bearing that you're given and the bearing that you have for that reference that you've got there? And there's a couple ways of looking at that. So this is what's called a hierarchy of conflicts. When a conflict occurs, the higher reference is selected. The one that's further up is the one that's selected. And some of these you have to do more research to find. For example, unwritten rights. Unwritten rights are usually things such as they may not be a recorded deed for it. It might be a prescriptive right, so that anything that you're trying to describe is always subject to other unwritten rights that you may or may not know about. Senior rights. This is when you're interpreting something that's been in a sequential conveyance, meaning it was not created all at one time, but part of it was sold and then they're trying to sell the other half of it. There's called junior rights and senior rights. The part that is it was already sold has senior rights over the part that's just being sold now. And then this is the written intent of the parties. And this is interesting in that if it says in here, thence along a certain line, that's what they're really trying to do. They're trying to go in along that written line. And then this is more for surveyors and at lines that are marked and run. You know, a surveyor for the most part is doing a retracement of the original monuments that are established when a parcel is first created. Matter of fact, almost 90% of all surveyors out there, all surveys that are being conducted are retracement surveys. They're trying to find the original monuments. So what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to walk in the footsteps of the original surveyor. They're trying to find whether or not they'd marked any lines, whether they made any notes on the survey as what it was. So they're trying to recreate those original lines that were marked and run, especially as you're going through some wooded areas. You'll find trees that are blazed. And then it starts getting into, well, if you've got a meets and bounds description that calls out a natural monument might be a tree, might be a river, might be some natural monuments that were in place there. And these are natural. They are not man-made, but they are natural. Those are it assumes that they don't never move. And again, we have this whole discussion about riparian and water, but Natural monuments, for the most part, are very high up on the order of what you can accept and what you should use when you're trying to remap these. And then it comes down to original monuments. Well, if a legal description says specifically, then go along the stone wall, that's an original monument that's called out in that legal description. And you want to go and use that original monument that's called out. And it could be thence to a 4x4 concrete monument. Or as we will see when we look back upon that legal description that I'm looking at, in there they actually call for a couple different components. They call for a right of way. They also call for a rebar. This is an iron rebar that gets put in the corner there. So if that was the first time it was done, that was the original monument. A record monument. A record monument does not mean that there's pieces of vinyl sitting out in the middle of the woods. It instead means that it's making a call to a recorded document. So, for example, in that description that we looked at, it made a record call. Let's go back there. It made a record call to here, thence run along the western boundary of this line, or the western boundary of this southeast quarter. That's a record call. Also, it makes a call to a rebar, which is steel rebar, lying on the southerly right-of-way line of a 100-foot road right-of-way known as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Road. That is a record call, a record monument. So again, no matter what it says as far as the bearings, the distances, if it makes a monument call, if it moves that bound call, that's the one you want to go and use. Let's go back here. That's the record call. Then it gets into occupation and possession, whether or not there's somebody occupying on that line, and that sort of gets into how a surveyor goes and evaluates this. And then, and only then, does it look at direction and distance or bearing and distance. So you can see that for the most part, the bearing and distance that's called in a meets and bounds description, those meets, those measurements have a lesser importance than some of the bounding calls on there. So bearing and distance, which is the combination of the two, and then distance, and then finally direction is even below the distance. Well, why is that? Because the distance was an actual measurement that was measured out there, but the direction has multiple different ways that you can reference it. It can be true north, it can be magnetic north, it can be an assumed bearing. There's a lot of variations in the way people reference these directions on them. So it's less reliable than the distances. And then finally, it gets down to area, and it gets down to coordinates that are looked at when you're trying to evaluate a legal description. What am I going to do? How am I going to go and input this in here when I'm going to map that? All right, so how do we do this inside of Pro? Well, it depends upon whether or not we're using simple tools, the regular ArcGIS Pro tools, or whether we're using the Parcel Fabric tools in here. Let's talk about first simple ArcGIS Pro tools. So when we do this, we'll have the Traverse tool. By far, that's the best one. And then a tool called Ground to Grid. Ground to Grid is a tool that we'll use when, in fact, we are looking to rotate things according to that assumed bearing that it says. So if the legal description says, and let's go back here, if the bearing says, thence run along this line, this westerly boundary line of the southeast quarter for this bearing, it then goes and establishes that that's the basis of the bearings, is that that line, as you've got it drawn, is assumed to bear that bearing. Well, the data set that we have doesn't have a great public land survey system on here, But so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go move down a little bit further, and then I'm going to go along here, thence leaving said boundary line, run along the southerly boundary of the right-of-way, 80 degrees, 56 minutes, 50 seconds east, 33.7 to the point of beginning. And I'll show you how to go and set up that basis of bearings so that you can figure out how to go and use it. So that's the ground to grid. And again, I recommend that you use ground to grid every time you go to do this. And then once you get it put in place, so these two elements here are establishing and creating the geometry of the boundary of the parcel that you're mapping by using the measurements. However, you then have to figure out, well, how do I fit it in and what happens with these different calls? That's the bounding. There's where you tell it where those are supposed to go to. That's where you use in the ArcGIS Pro tools, you use the align features tool. All right, so real simply, we're going to go and use a bearing and distance on here. I'm actually going to look over here, and I know you can't see this, but I'm going to go and map out some of this on here. And this is going to be on this here. I'm going to begin at this point, and I'm going to go down here to the point of beginning. I'm going to use the traverse tool, and I'm going to do this with my parcel lines, even though I'm not going to use the active parcel fabric. And I start there, and then I put my first line in there, which is to southerly right-of-way line, thence along southerly right-of-way line, 80 degrees, 56 minutes, 50 seconds, southeast. And I'm going to use the quadrant reference of -2 to do this. And I'm going to go 33.71 feet for my initial distance. And that's going to go and put it, I'm going to turn off my construction lines here. That's actually that line that I just put here. Now, if I go in here, there's a slight difference between these two. That is the southern right-of-way line according to our data. And here's the actual line as it's shown when I actually input the bearing. Now, this is a common mistake that a lot of people use, and they just keep going with this and then eventually rotate it. But I'm going to show you how to use the ground to grid tool. That tool is located on the Edit tab, and it's over here called Ground to Grid. And when I click on this, I'm going to pull this down and say, okay, I want to set a ground to grid. And I'm going to do this by entering the ground to grid, in which I'm going to tell it that I want this to go and reflect 80 degrees, 56 minutes, 50 seconds southeast. And once I've set a bearing in there, it now says, okay, go ahead and click on here and show me what that bearing is. And it doesn't have to be exactly at the point of beginning and the end on it. As long as I show it, that's a straight line, and that's what that bearing is. When I've done that now, it actually has gone and rotated that line, and it will assume that same rotation anytime I do any more of these. It will actually show me the rotation that's being applied to this from this point forward. All right. So ground to grid, by the way, it's not only on the Edit tab, but it's also down here on the bottom of the data frame and allows you to go and click on this button first to set it. And then this will show you that it's on. And if I turn it off, all right, you can see that this is no longer enabled. Now it's re-enabled. And if we zoomed in here real closely, you'll see that while I have a traverse open and I apply a ground to grid, it will apply that to everything inside that traverse. All right, now let me continue with this. Thence leaving. Oh, no, and then it says to the point of beginning. Thence continuing along the right of way, south 86. And because this repeats what's above here, I can just click on it there for a distance of 217.57 feet. All right. So I can also mark on here that I wish to go and automatically pan to the end of this. So I'm doing that. All right. To this point here. It's thence and south. 80 degrees, 56 minutes, 50 seconds. East. So it actually continues along this line again for 267.57 feet. All right. And it's 8100, 57 southeast, 577.19 feet to this point here. Marking a curve to the left, having a radius of 577. Let me see, let me pull this up so you can see this very quickly. Here, radius of this, southeasterly on the arc through a central angle of 0 degrees, 43 minutes, 1 second for a distance here along the chord being 88, 22, 22 east. So I'm going to input the chord distance on here, which is 82, 22, 22 east, southeast, but because it's a curve, I'm going to tell it this is a chord bearing on here. On the distance field, I'm going to input 0. And then for the radius field, I'm going to input a negative 577.59 feet. Why do I put a negative in there? Because it's a curve to the left, and that's a negative curve. And then I can go and tell it what other information I have. I can say 274.05 feet for my chord distance. I'm using the shortcut of C on here, and it will put that here to a point marking the intersection with the westerly right-of-way of a 50-foot road right-of-way known as Webster Road. Again, call this up to the westerly right-of-way. These are more bounds information telling me that's what this is supposed to be. And then it says then it's leaving said southerly right-of-way line, south 17 degrees, 58 minutes, 37 seconds, east for 642.01 feet, then 73, 35, 53, southwest, quadrant number 3 for 1192.83 feet. All right. Then it's leaving said northerly right-of-way alignments. Then it's 18 degrees, 02 minutes, 50 seconds, northwest for 769.28 feet. All right. And then 17, 58, 53, northwest, 208.69 feet. And then 18.0 0436 northwest, 231.84 feet to the point of beginning. And as soon as I get to within 1 foot, which is my option here of what my tolerance is, it will automatically close it there. So that then gives me the bearing and distance for the overall geometry of this. All right, so that's my lines describing my overall boundary for this property. My next step is then figure out, okay, do I have to go and realign anything? And first thing I want to do, I want to check it called for some rights of way here and here and here. Is this actually a road that I haven't seen? And sure enough, if I go in here, I can see that this is in fact a road. Doesn't look like it was constructed very well, but there is a road here all the way along here that looks like more of a rural road, but it is a road in here. So yeah, so the rights of way, it must be more of a rural road than anything else. All right. So the question now is, okay, do I have to make any adjustments before I go and build this? And what do I have to do in here? If I look, there's still a little bit of adjustment in here. And because there was a difference between what I had mapped before and what I'm mapping now, looks like there's a difference in points here. There's a difference in this angle here. Well, why could there have been a distance in the angle, a slight difference in the angle on here? Well, it turns out that what I did is I went and provided the chord length for that curve. But I have to remember that both the angle and the distance that's called out on the legal description, that this distance, these are not very precise. These are, in fact, rounded differences. So that this distance of 274.07 for the arc length, and actually here, um, that's a rounded distance, and I have to recognize that there's a difference here, and it may not be precise enough for what I was doing. So I just want to be aware that there's rounding issues here associated with making it more convenient for me to go and read on there. All right. So what do I do next? The question is, do I go and select all of these lines and create a new parcel? I can. I do. Well, if I'm in a non-parcel fabric traverse, how do I select all those lines that I just built? Well, it turns out there's a trick in the traverse file. If I still have my traverse file open, I can go here and select these lines and have them all selected for me automatically while I'm doing this. Once I have those lines selected, I can then get out of here, and there's a command called construct. All right, there's a construct polygon here, and I can tell it to construct a polygon here and go ahead and tell it to build a polygon. I now have this polygon that it just built for me, and I can go and fully go and um, and attribute that as I need on here for me. All right, on here. Now, the question is, well, what about the alignment issues on here? How do I do this if I'm not in the Parcel Fabric? There's a couple tools in here. I tend to use a couple of them more than any others. The tool that I most use is in fact the Align feature tool. All right, if I go up here, the Align feature tool. The Align feature tool allows me to go and select and draw a path and then have anything that's within a certain tolerance align to that path. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw, and let's say a 5-foot tolerance. And here is where I'm going to go and do the main adjustment here. I'm going to go and draw a endpoint arc and tell it if I start here and go to here, well, I can see that 5 foot is going to get that point moved over. It may not move that other point, but it will definitely get me so I'm coincident here. And I can say, go ahead and move that so it's coincident, and it will move it so that it is coincident on here. All right. So I'll use that for coincidence. Often I'll go and do a slight change in here. I might go and edit this vertex to go here, or I might move this vertex to move over to here. Again, there's some tools in here. I can select that vertex and move it. If I have topology turned on, there's a lot of things I can do in here. All right. I'm going to go and completely take that out, and I'm going to use it. Well, what happens if I'm in the Parcel Fabric? How do I go and actually edit this and create this in the Parcel Fabric? So by the way, I don't see anything in the chat yet, so that no comments or anything. I must be really good at explaining things, or maybe I just haven't explained it well enough. So let's go to the Parcel Fabric now. With the Parcel Fabric, it all revolves around a record. So when I create a record, it allows the Parcel Fabric tools or the normal ArcGIS Pro tools to become parcel enabled. So let me go and create a record in here, and I can just call this the demo. All right. And when did I do this? All right. And that's just going to create the beginning of a polygon for me. Now I can go through and do the entire traverse again, but I don't want to spend that time doing that. I actually have it saved here. So let's go to Parcel Fabric Tools, and let's go to Traverse. And I have here, and I'm going to do parcel lines, but I'm going to go and I'm going to load up or import a Traverse file that I have on my folder there. When I do this, it's going to go and bring that in, and it's going to go and put it from my point of beginning all the way around. And if you'll note, it went and had the same sort of issues in here that I wanted. I'm just going to show you how to do this in the Parcel Fabric. The Parcel Fabric, again, once I have this traverse in here, it automatically knows. I don't have to select these because I can go and say, hey, select everything as part of this, and it will automatically select this for me. I don't have to though, because it's sort of all automatically, it has the relationship class built in as part of the overall Parcel Fabric tools. It's watching what I'm doing. It's watching and marking everything according to that. And because of that, I can say, okay, well, now check to see whether or not it forms a closed polygon, in which case I can tell it to go ahead and do that. And it actually has what's called a seed. And a seed will allow me to go and take that and build it and expand it out to it until it fits that boundary. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell it, go ahead and check what I've built as part of this record and see if I'm missing anything as far as my topology rules. My topology rules say that the lines that are part of this record have to have points on them. So it's going to put points if I don't have points. It says that the polygon has to be expanded to the lines. It has to have lines on the end of it. So we'll take this seed and expand it to the lines, and it will build it all out. So we'll do everything to make sure that I have a good parcel built on here. And it's now gone and built that entire one. I still have the same issue here in that how do I go and get this to work in here? Well, with the Parcel Fabric, I have a tool called Align Parcels, which allows me to go and take and expand this out and look to see whether or not I have certain things. So I can say, well, generate this and see if anything within 5 feet is on here. And let me go and just start my anchor point in here. With an anchor point, tell it to generate this and tell it to then go and show me what adjustment it's going to make. And you can see that it's gone and adjusted this point down to here so that it will match. It did not adjust this over to here. It adjusted the line straight to it. But I can actually tell it to go and link if I want. I can tell it to take this point and move it here if I'd like to do that. I can tell it to go ahead and generate it again. And in fact, it will go and generate, showing me what this is going to look like. I can then say, go ahead and align this up and get off of my align parcels. And it will have aligned everything in here. Just to show you I'm in here. And it aligned it all up so that it's closed down. I can then go and take this one polygon and I can clip it out of the parcel underneath and tell it to just go ahead and clip it out of there. I now have my remaining parcel and I have my new parcel that's built in here. So what I've done here is I've taken and looked at the tools inside ArcGIS Pro. Use the traverse tool. Well, it turns out you use the traverse tool in both of them, but in one of them, it has additional powers above and beyond just the standard one if you're in a Parcel Fabric. I'm going to use the ground to grid. I can use the ground to grid either one of those. I didn't have to set it because I had already set it one time. With the Pro tools, you can just use the line features. And then you might wind up doing some tweaking with the vertices. With the Parcel Fabric, oh, I didn't show you the Kogo reader, did I? Let's go ahead. We've got time. Let's go ahead and read that. But I took the traverse, ground to grid, aligned parcels, and then I could have used the merge points to make that final point adjustment on here. Let's do that anyway. The merge points tool here. It's a tool in the quality driven tab. I can tell it to merge points and select points. Oh, I only had one there because it automatically adjusted it down to there. So I don't have any additional points that I need to go and look at. So I think that's more than I need to do there. So let's go back to this Kogo reader and how this actually works. The Kogo reader is one of those tools inside of here, and it is only Parcel Fabric. It's only Parcel Fabric right now. And what this allows you to do is this allows you to go and it opens up another pane that is separate from your standard pane. And it allows you to go and read in a legal description. And let's go here. Here's my legal description. And we'll read in the legal description. It will go and process it, pulling out all of the elements in here that it needs for this legal description. Now, it turns out that because what's happening is not necessarily AI, it's not artificial intelligence here. This is actually pattern recognition on here. And I've already processed this through, so I know what's happening. Turns out that those pieces of text, those characters which are in a color, have been recognized as some of these patterns that it should look for. And it should look for a certain sequencing of them. For example, a bearing, and then a distance means it's probably a straight line. Same with bearing and distance, bearing and distance. And then it says here, then marking a curve to the left. Well, it actually did a pretty good job. By the way, it did This was the original connection lines, which went from the point of commencement to the point of beginning. It pulled those out well. And then here's the parcel lines that it pulled out. And it pulled them out well until it got to that curve. And it's in the curve that it wound up having a problem, only because of the way that curve was described. All right, because it described it in two different ways. The way it described the chord bearing, all right, and the central angle confused it. It's not used to seeing this pattern in here as much. So if I had gone and said, well, how about if I took this out? If I took this out and deleted that and told it to rerun, will it identify this better? And in fact, if you look, it actually did. I now have a closure of 0 because it did not recognize the way that that legal description was written as being both of those things being part of that curve. So it does a really good job with pattern recognition, but it doesn't have all the patterns yet. And I envision that Esri's going to be putting a whole lot of effort into new patterns, looking for new ways of figuring out how to describe some of these things in here. But you can see it already did a great job on this on here. I can actually then go and say, well, let's set our point of commencement on here, set our starting point. This is our, excuse me, this is our point of beginning for this. And then I can actually tell it, go ahead and add that to the map. And I think I actually sent the whole thing over there, didn't I? Let's go, yeah, I did. I sent the whole thing over there. But let's go and pull that traverse out. So let's show you another little trick. With the traverse tool, if I set this for a specific type of line, for example, this parcel lines, I can then go in here and trace this line. And when I'm done, it actually will load it into here for me if I'd like. So, but you have to be tracing that same sort of line. And now I can tell it, well, maybe the start is here and let it reset that start for where it was instead. All right. Looked at a couple different sets of tools in here. There's a couple important things I want to make sure we recognize as part of a meets and bounds description. One, that the measurements that those COGO values that are being extracted from the legal description, those are sort of hints or guides to where it's supposed to be. It's actually the bearings, or excuse me, the references to the actual intent of what those lines are supposed to be. That's what's important on them. And then secondly, well, why is there a difference between what I have and what's in my mapping, or what I have and what I think it is? And a lot of that could be either the precision of the measuring tools or the differences between ground and grid distances. Remember, bearing and distance, excuse me, distances in a legal description are always given on ground distance because you're expected to go and recreate this on the ground, not on the grid. But when we're mapping it in the GIS, we're always mapping it on some sort of projection. So we're mapping it on a grid. So remember those two things. When you're looking at a legal description, a meets and bounds description, when you're looking at this, you want to look at both things. You want to look at the COGO portion of it for the measurements, for the meets. And that's going to give you the overall geometry of your parcel. And then you're going to use all the other pieces of text, what those lines are supposed to be, where they're supposed to be, that sort of thing to help you refine where that's actually located for you. All right. Any questions then? I haven't seen any comments in here. So any questions or comments on here? If not, I hope you enjoyed this. And if you have any questions, anything you want, all my information is here. Or if you click over on the QR code, you'll be put, or I'll be put in your contact list. So again, thank you. We'll see you next time.